Hello and welcome to the International Postdoc Forum for the Philosophy of Science, hosted by the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science. My name is Alan Love. I'm the director of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science, and I'm happy that you are here with us today for this session. I want to highlight two quick things before we turn to today's speaker. The first is a reminder about how the International Postdoc Forum for Philosophy of Science came to be. It was what one might call a positive effect of COVID, because we saw during that time that there was a need for opportunities for especially emerging scholars and recent PhDs to have opportunities to present their research due to so much cancellation and restrictions on travel. The program has been so successful that as we slowly emerge from the pandemic and transition into something like a new normal, we are continuing it because we think it has great value. And we are showcasing in particular these virtual research presentations from international scholars with commentaries from local MCPS community members. That brings me to the second point about procedure. So today we will follow the following structure. First, we will have the presentation of the research. After that presentation, there will be a commentary. And after the commentary, the speaker will have an opportunity to respond to the commentary directly. And then at that time, we'll open things up for a general question and answer session. During that general session, you are able to ask questions either verbally, raising your hand, or you can put questions in the chat or the Q&A function as well, and I will read them out. Obviously, you can put those in at any point in time as they occur to you, and we will be able to circle back to them during that time. But now let me introduce our speaker. So today, Martin Zak is joining us from the Department of Analytic Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy at the Czech Academy of Sciences. And his presentation today is going to be on rethinking the nature of immunity. So let me hand things over to Martin. Martin, please.
Hello, everyone. So first of all, I would like to thank Alan for the kind invitation. And it's a great pleasure to be presenting my work here at the International Postdoc Forum. It's actually quite funny because a few months ago, I published a paper in which I provided some criticism of a particular point of a paper authored by Alan Love. And a couple of months later, then this invitation came, and with it also, then I learned that Alan is going to be providing the commentary on my work. So I'm just hoping it's not a trap. With that joke aside, I'm going to share my screen, which you should be able to see now. Hopefully, if not, please let me know. So what I'm going to present here is actually a joint work with a colleague of mine, Gregor Gressler from Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna. And so actually, if you are interested in the topic of immunology, philosophy of immunology, or topics of aging, or microbiome research, and also the issue of structure and function debates, then please also do check Gregor's work. But let's proceed with this presentation. So the driving idea behind this talk is really a question, a very general question, and that's how should we think about immunity in the most general possible way. One thing that seems to be derivable from immunological writings is what we call standard framework. According to this standard framework, immunity is especially or predominantly construed as something that can be spoken about in terms of strong or weak defense. Now, the idea here is to call this framework into question. That's one thing. And the other thing is to provide an alternative framework for this very general thinking about immunity. And such a framework really should focus on what we call organizing principles of immunity. So what is actually the standard view of immunity? So I've mentioned that it relates to strong and weak defense. And this is something that actually can be traced back to at least the work of Koch and Pasteur and the germ theory of disease, where germs were found to be causing diseases, and this sort of called for the way in which us humans, but also other organisms, can defend themselves against those microbes. And so the idea is that there is something as the immune system that actually provides this defensive function of our body, and therefore it fights off pathogens. Now, clearly, with the recent years and still ongoing, the COVID-19 pandemic reminds us all that reminds us about this very lively issue about pathogens. And one of those pathogens is SARS-CoV-2, again, causing the disease COVID-19, and basically challenging us again to think about the immune system as the thing that we use to defend ourselves against this pathogen. So in more general terms, it is that the host, or sometimes also referred to as self, defends itself from the pathogen, something called non-self. And in immunology, this distinction is quite pronounced still to this day, meaning that, again, the host and the host cells are basically protected by the immune system, and that the immune system makes this distinction between what is self and what is foreign or what is non-self, and targets this non-self for destruction. And finally, the idea is also that the stronger the defense, the better for the host or for the organism, because clearly destroying the invader is for the benefit of the host. Now, this very general idea of immunity or the immune system serving the function of defense is problematic, as it turns out. So one reason for this is that the immune system is actually involved in many other functions beyond defense. And these functions include, for instance, the clearance of debris, which is very important, because otherwise the organism would simply succumb to basically the waste produced by cell death and other things. The immune system is also involved in tissue repair and in the maintenance of tissue homeostasis, but most importantly, it is also involved in development, which clearly cannot be construed as a defense function at all, even if the other kinds of functions could somehow be construed as defense functions, provided a liberal enough interpretation of the notion of defense. Furthermore, all these functions are actually not just in the purview of the immune system, but are realized and executed by all the other systems in the organism. So it is actually suggesting that what we need to consider we need to consider more broadly is this physiological crosstalk between different kinds of systems, which all together realize all these different functions. Speaking of defense, it should be also stated that traditionally, again, the idea was that the immune system protects, helps the host to protect itself by either eliminating a pathogen or somehow expelling the pathogen, right? Or any other means that basically get rid of the pathogen. However, more recently, or arguably, actually, the idea is very old, stretching as far as more than 100 years to the past. There is this other strategy that the host uses to defend itself, namely disease tolerance. And disease tolerance has no impact on the pathogen load, but it is crucial for the host to maintain its health or to mitigate disease, and in other words, to basically to keep protection from the pathogen. And this idea of disease tolerance, decreasing the susceptibility of tissues to damage, is also realized by other physiological systems, many of which, or pathways, many of which are lying outside of the usual domains of the immune system. And since the traditional view of defense, as well as this new notion of disease tolerance, is integrated in the host, then we need to think about the immune system again in much broader terms. And this idea has been recently, together with Gregor, whom I mentioned at the beginning. So we together published a recent paper where we discuss these ideas in more detail. So now, hopefully, I provided some reasons for thinking that thinking about the immune system in terms of merely as a defense is problematic. Now, I mentioned that the immune system is construed as a strong or weak defense system usually. And so it's time to turn the page and look at the possible notions of or meanings of the notions of strong and weak. So what could they mean? So here's a quote, just taken more or less randomly. So it's not intended to be a criticism of Hotamis Ligil as an author, but rather as a case or as a particular example of a much broader style of thinking. And so the quote basically reads like this. So the evolutionary advantages of strong defense system are obvious in protecting against pathogens, and as a strong immune response is dependent on energy sources, one can also argue that the integration of these systems and their cooperation in responding to fluctuations in the energy and nutrient environment would be highly advantageous. So with that in mind, let's look at the possible meanings of strong and weak. First of all, if you take a look at the immunological literature, by far the most predominant notion of either strong or weak can be cashed out in terms of quantitative measurements. So this is what we call the quantitative allure of the notions of strong and weak. So what do we mean by that? Well, usually if you hear or if you read the notion of a strong immune response or weak immune response, usually this is somehow meant to refer to quantitative measurements of certain immune mediators or effectors. And this could be anything from, let's say, some proteins, could be things like cytokines or antibodies, but it can be also like the number of cells, for instance. Now, the problem with this is that these notions are also suggestive, so they have all sorts of connotations. And by just taking the quantitative measurements, this is not actually too much telling about what the immune outcome will be. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you take a look at the immune response, it is not just about the quantitative, the quantitative measurement of things, but also about the temporal dimension in which those quantities come about. It is also important to think about qualitative modifications to those quantities. So, for instance, post-translational modifications that are regulated. So these are also important to estimate what the outcome is going to be, and it is not so much dependent on the quantitative on the quantities themselves. Another reason, and really the most important reason for perhaps putting doubt on the usefulness of the notions of strong and weak, is that these quantitative measurements can be as well formulated in in less loaded terms, such as high or low quantities, for instance, or any other such terms that are not as loaded as the notions of strong and weak. So now, again, as I mentioned, the idea or the driving question is about general understanding of immunity or the immune system. And so this is just one possibility of how the strong and weak can be construed. But there are, as the quote above suggests, there are reasons for maybe adopting or looking at different notions of strong and weak and seeing how they fare when thinking about immunity. And so what should be stated that if those notions are taken to be generally applicable to the immune system, then we run into several difficulties. So one of those is that there are normative connotations connected with these notions. So usually, as again the quote suggests, strong is somehow thought to be a beneficial feature of an immune response, beneficial to the host, whereas weak immune response would be something detrimental to the host. However, as we know, this is not always the case. So, for instance, if we were to use those notions and apply them, then there are clear examples where they actually would change the meaning so that the strong response would be actually detrimental and the weak response is in fact beneficial. So an example of this is a cytokine storm, which could be construed as a too strong response, which is detrimental to the host. And there are also situations where immunologists write about weak immune response, and for instance, they mean low quantities of antibodies, and that feature is actually beneficial to the host because because it shows that these hosts are doing better in terms of health outcomes. So there is also paradoxical connotation connected with these notions. So something that can be construed as strong, but in fact it can also be construed as weak. Therefore, it's paradoxical that both connotations can be applicable to the same thing. So again, just to give you a very quickly an example, think about immunodeficiencies. So immunodeficiencies are usually thought in terms of some weakness, some weak immunity, that the immune system is weakened somehow by carrying this immunodeficiency. However, there are many examples where such a deficiency causing a defect, an immune defect, actually turns out to bring with it too strong responses, and these are even not survivable by the host. So one example is a mutation in the regulatory T cells, basically preventing them from developing. And it has been found out that this condition, this immunodeficiency, leads to death, and because the immune system destroys the organism. Another example, or rather another category of these notions, is the following. So let's assume that we can actually meaningfully apply them in a context where we think about these notions as two different extremes on a continuum. So that would mean that we can move along the axis between strong and weak, and we can perhaps make something stronger or weaker. However, in some cases, this cannot be meaningfully done. So why not? Well, because some immune cells are rather specialized, and that's also true about some immune organs. So, for instance, thymus is an important immune organ, and if you remove that organ in before puberty, then basically or very few T cells will develop. So if we were to then think in terms of strong and weak and making things stronger and weaker, it is basically impossible to make the system stronger and weaker in terms of T cells, because the thymus was removed. Therefore, there is nothing to be made stronger or weaker. It's simply no longer there to change. Perhaps the best example of the problems connected with these notions is that in some immunological phenomena, these meanings really do not these notions do not carry a meaning. So again, some very quick examples. One is that the immune system, as I mentioned before, is involved in maintaining tissue homeostasis. And in that particular context, it is problematic to think in terms of strong and weak, because it doesn't really make sense to speak about stronger or weaker homeostasis, since again, homeostasis is something that is maintained, and it's either there or there is no homeostasis. And so this is something that cannot be meaningfully captured by these notions of strong and weak. And finally, also those notions seem to mischaracterize the immune system in an interaction with other physiological systems. So again, just one example is, for instance, the nervous system. It's been well documented now that the immune system and nervous systems interact in many ways, and not just in disease context, but also in contexts which are concern usual functions, like for instance cognition. And again, it would not make too much sense to construe cognition as strong or weak, at least not in any ordinary sense of those meanings. So taken together, the problem is that either those notions can be replaced by things like low or high when we think about quantities. And another reason for thinking that there is an issue is that these notions are really ill-defined, as I tried to show by going through the list of 2 to 6 and the examples that illustrate that. And so it is not the issue that, for instance, when immunologists use those notions, that they would be somehow not knowing what they are talking about, and they would need somehow help, but rather that when not sufficiently clear on these issues, it is very likely that there is a talk that the talk is basic. Well, they are talking cross purposes. So far, I've argued against construing immunity in terms of strong and weak defense. So let's continue with the assumption that this framework will not do justice to the diversity and all the functions of the immune system. So what is there left for us? Well, what Gregor and I try to suggest is that there is another way of thinking about the immune system, and that's in terms of what we call the Pareto framework. And Pareto stands for contextuality, regulation, and trade-offs. So what this framework attempts to accomplish is basically to account for the most general organizing principles of immunity. And it is a conceptual approach that we think could guide the inquiry into the fundamentals of immunity. So what I want to say is, what I want to note is that this framework is also somehow already there in the immunological writings. So immunologists very oftentimes, note about context dependency of various phenomena. They are very well aware, of course, about the very crucial aspect of regulation, and also they are very well know. They very well know about all about the various trade-offs that are found in the functioning of the immune system. But what we try to suggest is that by considering this, by harvesting basically these notions and systematizing them, we can maybe suggest something as a sort of a guiding principle to immunological research. So whenever something is found out, it would be worthwhile to actually considering explicitly. So under what circumstances this is valid, and perhaps under what circumstances this is not valid, what is regulating this, what we found out, and what are the trade-offs, because it is basically given that there are going to be trade-offs, and it's crucial to always keep this in mind. So let's look at these individual notions in more detail. So let's start with the first one, namely contextuality. And the idea here is that basically the outcome of an immune response is always context dependent, and it depends on many factors. And really it comes down to what is going on and when it is going on. And it is important to know that without contextuality, without this context dependency or thinking in terms of contextuality, it is impossible to understand basically any immunological phenomenon. So I will give you again several examples. Basically any signaling pathway or a molecule or a cell, what it does is understandable only in terms of a broader context. Just to again be more specific about what is meant by this is consider, for instance, generally immune functions. So whether or not an organism, whether or not the immune response is targeted against a pathogen, for instance, or whether it is engaged in tissue repair depends on the tissue context. Because it's not that all those functions are triggered at the same time. It's not that they are triggered one after the another. It is that they have to be triggered in a way depending on what the tissue environment dictates, basically. And without this contextual thinking, it would be also impossible to realize how is it so that a given signaling pathway can lead to two different outcomes. And the answer is then obviously due to the different tissue context or cellular context as well. So another very general example here concerns the feature of pathogenicity. So what is a pathogen is not something intrinsic to the microbe. It is also not fully dependent on the host itself, but rather it is something that comes about from the interaction between the microbe and the host. And one example of that is pathobionts, or opportunistic pathogens. So these are, for instance, parts of your microbiome that under regular conditions do not cause any harm and could be even beneficial. However, if the conditions change into, let's say, unfavorable conditions, these microbes can wreak havoc and therefore turn from beneficial to actually detrimental microbes. And finally, let's consider immunodeficiency as an example, again, of the necessity of contextual thinking. So before I say something about immunodeficiency, the notion of immunocompetency is supposed to be something that is opposite to immunodeficiency, and it is usually that those who are immunocompetent are actually well off when it comes to infectious diseases, for instance. But what is really immunocompetency? There is no clear definition, and also this is because what is immunocompetency is context dependent. So think of, for instance, aging, right? So when we are young, the status of immunocompetency, which is basically that there is no known immunodeficiency, is something that is very different from when we are adult and from when we are old. But also the fact is that even though one is immunocompetent, there are various genetic differences between immunocompetent people, and these differences can explain also how is it that even though a group of people are immunocompetent, they nevertheless progress in different ways when it comes to, for instance, infectious diseases, but not only infectious diseases, of course. Returning to the point of immunodeficiency, so one example is malnutrition. Malnutrition is considered to be a so-called an example of so-called secondary immunodeficiency, and it is something that we usually think that is detrimental to the host. However, there are some very particular and specific examples, such as in iron deficiency, some particular kinds of iron deficiency, in malaria infection, where in fact such immunodeficiency is beneficial to the host. And so again, to explain this, we need to consider the broader context and therefore employ contextual thinking. So the other general notion and general feature of the immune system is regulation. So whenever an immune response is triggered, there is usually a cascade of events, and there are basically positive feedbacks that are driving this cascade of events, and that requires also negative feedback in order to not spiral out of control. And in fact, many diseases, if not all, are due to somehow dysregulation. So that is when the positive feedback is basically too much, or when there is lack of negative feedback, which prevents the system from regulating itself. And again, let's take some examples. So one example that I've already mentioned in the context of acute inflammation concerns the cytokine storm, when basically the host produces so much of cytokines that do all sorts of things in the body and basically lead to the immunopathology and death. Another example of the importance of regulation is in aging or obesity and many other conditions where we usually think about chronic inflammation. And here it is usually thought that, for instance, an aged organism like elderly humans have somehow weak immune system. But in fact, that's not the case. Rather, the case is that elderly or aging organisms exhibit this feature of chronic inflammation and other features that have to do with immunosenescence. And these features rather prime the some immune cells of the individual to basically trigger a response that is more vigorous in a sense than if the organism is adult, just regular adult. So rather, again, what we see here is again the problem when thinking about strong and weak, because even though the aged organism is more easily succumbs to the infection, it is not because it is weaker, but rather because it is in some sense stronger. And in fact, this issue is an issue of regulation not working as it should. Another different example concerns tissue repair. So tissue repair is extremely important for an organism to survive and maintain itself. However, if it's again too pronounced, if it's for too long or in chronic phase, it leads to fibrosis and therefore it limits tissue function. So even these processes have to be well regulated. And finally, it goes without saying that in medical interventions, the feature of regulation is even more pronounced. And this is especially so when we consider targeting immune system in diseases such as cancer, where immunotherapies have been celebrating some nice successes in treating certain kinds of cancer. And these basically interventions trigger or help certain cells, immune cells like T cells, to work beyond their normal physiological limits, thereby going over the regulatory mechanisms. And in doing so, what is also sometimes observed is the development of immunopathology, such as autoimmune diseases. So keeping in check in these kind of conditions, but also in transplanted organs, for instance, when we need to do the opposite, namely to immunosuppress the patient, these things mess up or somehow interfere with normal regulatory mechanisms. And finally, the third feature of the immune system concerns trade-offs. So these can be roughly defined as a, for instance, as a particular feature that confirms some benefit to the host with respect to some particular condition, while at the same time, that very same feature puts the host in risk with respect to another condition. So let's take some examples again. So whenever there is some perturbation to the homeostasis, there are sensors that basically sense the stress. Or if that stress cannot be maintained, then there is damage, and the damage is sensed, and again, there is a damage response to that damage. And these stress and damage responses work in an inducible manner. And what this means is that they operate at the expense of normal cell or tissue function in order to maintain what can be construed as core tissue or cell functions. So when this takes place, the secondary functions basically have to be on hold. And clearly then this means that there is a trade-off between maintaining the core functions but not being able to maintain the secondary or less pronounced functions, at least less pronounced in terms of survival, for instance. So another kind of trade-off that can be mentioned, an important one, is again genetic makeup. So I was mentioning the issue of immunocompetency and the idea that there is genetic variation, which is not necessarily, or rather not at all, connected with any sort of immunodeficiency, right? So what is known is that a particle genetic makeup, an example could be major histocompatibility complex or HLA when we think about just humans. So there are different alleles, and these different alleles, even though they provide basically benefits in terms of, for instance, defense, when it comes to certain conditions or certain infectious agents, these very same alleles actually make us more susceptible to other conditions, including other infectious agents. And of course, there are trade-offs when it comes to medical intervention. So again, just to reuse an example I gave, think about cancer immunotherapies causing autoimmune diseases in some subset of patients and in some subset of those therapies. Or think about, again, organ transplants when in order to accommodate the transplanted organ, the patient has to be put on immunosuppressive therapies, which then put them into greater danger of infectious diseases. So let me conclude. So I try to provide some arguments against the strong and weak defense framework, which seems to be still somewhat popular in immunological writing. Now, together with the Coreto framework, that's the contextuality, regulation, and trade-offs, this should help us to see better the way how to understand, in very general terms, the organizing principles of immunity. So it is not just about arguing against the strong and weak defense framework, but also proposing a more positive account in order to be in a better position to realize what is the driving force behind the immune system. And with that, I would like to thank, well, thank you, first of all, for being here and listening. I would also like to thank people at the Conceptual Biology and Medicine group, the Immunoconcept Lab in Bordeaux, where I spent some time together with Gregor, actually, and who provided us some feedback on earlier versions of this paper. I also would like to thank Gerard Aberl, who is an immunologist at the Pasteur Institute, also for providing us feedback on earlier draft. And if you want to maybe follow some philosophy of immunology or immunology broadly, then also feel free to follow us on Twitter. And with that, thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you very much, Martin, for your talk. Let me first say that this was not a trap. So that was not the intent. But second, you are wrong. I'll have to tell you why on another occasion. But for today, I get to be a commentator on your presentation, Rethinking the Nature of Immunity. So let me just pull up my slides here, and then I can do that. All right. So I think everybody should be able to see that. If not, just let me know. What I want to do in this short commentary is mostly raise a number of questions that we can talk about together. But before I do that, I also want to reiterate some of the main elements of Martin's thesis so that we're all thinking about them together. So that's what I'll do first. I will talk a little bit about how I see the big picture argument that's offered. And then I will turn to a number of different questions for discussion, and each of these I'll sort of elaborate a little bit, but just by way of preview, they'll concern questions about what is the immune system and how we think about individuating it. What is a general framework or account that's not a theory of immunity per se, which is an important distinction that's made by Martin and Gregor. Is the strong, weak framing actually doing that much conceptual work? What does it mean to call it a received view? And is the new account, the Coretto account, sufficiently specific? Don't these features apply to other physiological systems? Raising a question about to what degree it might not actually be a general account of the immune system, but rather a generic account of any physiological system. So let me then turn to reviewing the main thesis. So clearly this is in view, the dominant framework view of immunity among working scientists is that it's a system of defense, which can be characterized by a capacity for stronger or weaker defense. And according to Martin and Gregor, this framework view has two key problems. The immune system is not only engaged in defense, and there are different meanings for stronger or weaker immunity that yield a distorted picture of what the immune system is and how it operates when applied generally. They offer an alternative framework with three elements that constitute the organizing principles of the immune system: contextuality, regulation, and trade-offs. That's the Coretto account per se. So there's a primary criticism of the field and the way in which it appeals to the defense framework and uses the stronger or the weaker qualifiers. And then there is an alternative framework that is supposed to improve that. And just to share a little bit, because I was privy to a manuscript that the talk was based on, so I had a chance to see a little bit more of that argument in detail in advance. So in that manuscript, one of the things that is highlighted is that such a framework fails to capture the general nature of the immune system because it omits immune functions and interactions that are unrelated to defense. Interpreting quantitative measurements of immune responses in terms of strength and weakness does not add epistemic value to those measurements. And then we argue that the strong-weak framework fails at providing a general account of immunity. So a couple things to highlight here, which I've done with the underlining. One is the generality or general account, which plays a key role here in these criticisms, and then also the idea of epistemic value and whether or not a framework is contributing to that. The recommendation, which I think didn't come across as much in the presentation, but ultimately the argument is that if we want a general understanding of immunity, what the immune system is, what it does, and why it sometimes fails, the idea that the immune system is first and foremost a defense system characterized in terms of strength or weakness must be abandoned. And similarly, in the conclusion, these notions are ill-defined and misleading and should be abandoned. So I think this is important to flag because a key part of the argument is that this framework cannot be rescued or fixed or somehow tinkered with, but rather needs to be completely thrown out and something new put in its place. Okay, so that is just a basic review of what I take to be some of the core points of the presentation. Now let me turn to questions that I have. And the first sort of set of questions is, what is the immune system and how is it individuated? In thinking about how we might individuate a system or any kind of component in a organism or a living unit, one of the things we could do is adopt a structural approach. And we could ask, what constitutes the immune system? What are its components? What is it made up of? And this is a minor element of the criticism that's offered by Martin. But I think it's important to notice that other systems besides the immune system have diverse kinds of parts in complex hierarchical relations. So it sort of pushes us to ask, how is the boundary drawn structurally between system and environment or other systems on this particular account? Of course, we could also individuate functionally. What does the immune system do? And this is actually, I think, the more major element of the criticism that's offered in the paper. But notice that other systems are functionally individuated, yet often have more than one core activity. So we would then also be pushed to ask, how is the boundary drawn functionally between system and environment or other systems? So there's a key question here about, to what degree in individuating this thing called the immune system, we should draw on structural, functional, or both kinds of criteria to talk about what it is. And that obviously will have an impact on the line of argumentation that Martin offered. Second set of questions has to do with this issue of generality. What is a general framework or an account that's not a theory of immunity? Why would we even want one? I think there's two kind of concerns lurking in the background here. What is this thing, generality? The generality of a framework looms really large in the criticism offered. I think this was clearly presented in the paper, but is also in the presentation as well. But we might ask, why is generality the dominant epistemic value in characterizing the immune system? Why is it the case that whatever account is offered, generality is the appropriate criterion for that? There isn't really any explicit argument for this commitment that I saw. Second, why do we want or need it? What role does a general mindset or framework view play in scientific reasoning? So you might wonder whether or not we even need a general mindset or a framework. And it could be that some of the criticisms that are offered of the immune system as a defense system are absolutely correct if you wanted a general framework. But maybe if you didn't, then those would no longer be as cogent. I mean, is it the case that, to have a general framework, we're somehow offering conceptual guardrails that prevent biologists from forgetting complex constitution or multifunctionality? Maybe there's other options, but we just would want to know, why is it that we're seeking this general framework? Third set of questions, is the strong, weak framing actually doing that much conceptual work? What does it mean to call it a received view? Could it be operating more locally or contextually? So here's a couple things that seemed puzzling to me. If the strong, weak immunity framing is present, then isn't it playing some conceptual role in the scientific reasoning? It would be odd if it was completely idle, especially given that it's so pervasive. So you've got this appeal to strong and weak quite ubiquitously present in the scientific discourse, but it would be really strange to say it's not doing any work. But if it's doing some kind of work, then what kind of work is it doing we don't want to necessarily abandon it if it's doing some kind of good work. And maybe that work is not as central or general as we might think. It could play some supporting or subsidiary role in the reasoning. How do we know it's a received view? I think I tend to agree with Barton that the strong and weak kind of framing is relatively widespread, but at the same time, I think it's not clear that we have a sufficient evidence base for saying that it's operating as a general framework in the fields of immunology or those that are interested in the immune system. And then finally, if we set aside full generality, the value of quantitative ascriptions of immune strength and weakness could play local or contextual roles. So again, if we're not thinking about strong and weak in this fully general way, you might be able to talk about strong and weak for a particular disease condition or expectations for a particular stage of life history. So there's a difference here between adding general epistemic value and adding specific epistemic value. Could it be the case that the strong-weak framing adds specific epistemic value, even though it might fail in adding general epistemic value? And I think if you look at each of those criticisms that was leveled by Martin in the talk, they're just listed here, I won't go through them. I think that a lot of these escape when you treat them in terms of local application, because you can understand how they might not have the paradoxical connotation, or why the quantitative allure might actually have a certain sort of significance in one context and not another. And it's really the generality assumption that yields these kinds of criticisms. Lastly, is the new account sufficiently specific? Don't these features apply to other physiological systems? So if we think about the cardiovascular system, for example, it seems like I also can talk about contextuality. I also can talk about regulation, and I also can talk about trade-offs. And it's not just the cardiovascular system, but of course, other organ systems that are present in organisms seem like they operate according to similar sorts of principles. So in the paper, Martin says the outcome of an immune response is essentially dependent on the context, which in turn is determined by a multitude of factors, including the kinetics of the response. It seems like I could substitute another system. The outcome of a cardiovascular response is essentially dependent on the context, which in turn is determined by a multitude of factors, including the kinetics of the response. Or for regulation, any immune function must be finely tuned and tightly regulated by both internal and external signals. Any cardiovascular function must be finely tuned and tightly regulated by both internal and external signals. And then finally, trade-offs. Having a particular feature very often confers some benefit to the host with respect to some particular condition, while at the same time that very same feature also puts the host in disadvantage with respect to another condition. And it seems like one can clearly talk about features of other systems besides the immune system that exhibit these kinds of trade-offs, and that therefore these kinds of principles also apply to other system responses and function beyond the immune system, and therefore are not necessarily then good characterizations of the organizing principles for the immune system. So the thorny worry here is that the organizing principles are too general and don't uniquely pick out the immune system. All right, so let me just wrap up. By way of conclusion, clearly it is important to recognize that the immune system is involved in more than resistant defense. and that attributions of strength and weakness can be ambiguous. I certainly don't want to argue with those ideas. I think there's a lot of value in the way in which Martin and Gregor unpack those details in the paper. However, it's not as clear that the principles of individuation for the immune system are adequately specified, nor that there's a justification for the appeal of a general framework, whatever generality might mean, nor that the strong-weak framing adds no epistemic value. In fact, if you relax the generality requirement, it seems like it could add a certain kind of epistemic value, even if it's not the kind of epistemic value that is preferred in the paper. Additionally, the new account has overly generic organizing principles that seem applicable to other systems and do not uniquely pick out the immune system. And that seems to be a problem if the account is supposed to be about what the immune system is. And with that, I say thank you, and we'll turn back to Martin and give him an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, thanks so much for the feedback. I appreciate very much all the comments, and I'm happy to try and think about how to answer some of the points you just raised. But of course, I think I will fail to do justice to everything you said, but definitely this is something to keep thinking about in more details later on. So basically, you, for instance, asked what is the immune system, and suggested that there could be a structural and functional individuations. And so it is not actually what we do in detail in this paper, but in the other paper that I mentioned in the presentation, is that we suggest that, for instance, when it comes to structural individuation of the immune system, this is actually really problematic, and it also applies to the functional individuation. And this is because, as some immunologists have suggested, there is some reason to think that every cell actually is an immune cell, whatever that means, right? So the important thing is to explain then what is it that whatever it means, and that is basically that some of the specific functions ascribed to the immune cells, like phagocytosis or productions of cytokines, is also achieved by other cells, like nervous cells, for instance. And so it is actually very difficult to both structurally but also functionally distinguish between an immune system and another system, even though, of course, there are some differences, such as the fact that immune cells, like traditionally construed immune cells, have a shared origin, namely that they come from hematopoietic stem cells. But again, the same sort of structural and functional features are also basically realized by non-hematopoietic stem cells. So this is not an easy task to do, and then also this is the reason, or this is an answer that I will get to when I discuss some of your other questions or worries that you raised. So then you asked what is the general framework or account. So as we note in the paper, and as you noted yourself, we don't think it's a sort of a theory. So by a theory, we mean something like a theory of immunogenicity. So an immunological theory that accounts for when the immune system is triggered or triggers a response, as opposed to when it's not triggering a response. And so in our case, we mean to use framework or account very loosely, rather as something that that just basically is a way of thinking about the particular issue. And So why do we need a general framework or account? Well, I think because we need to be general, and that means going beyond defense in order to appreciate functions other than defense. And this calls for basically a general framework, I think. Then the question is whether the strong and weak framing actually is doing much of conceptual work, and that's and if it does, then maybe we should not completely abandon it. Also, how do we know that it is a received view, and where is the evidence? Maybe there is some specific epistemic value when it comes to at least some disease conditions. So when it comes to whether or not it is a received view, this is something that we haven't done, but it could be established on the basis of like bibliographical, research. So we could just look for like quantitative usages of words on a database of immunological papers, and basically how prevalent this is, and then maybe do some qualitative additional qualitative work to establish that it is so. But if you talk to so that would be the hard work. But if you do the other possibility, which is if you talk to enough immunologists, and if you read enough papers, then I think it is, even though still anecdotal, it seems to be the most predominant way of construing the immune system. And it is actually, it has been argued by immunologists before, and it's also something that is maybe most prominent in the way in which research is, in what kind of research is the most prominent, for instance. And it is still infectious diseases or defense against cancer, or basically in those contexts, as opposed to other contexts that are not as prominent in the published work. And also, I wanted to note one more thing regarding this. So you mentioned whether or not it is any specific epistemic value, and it may be, but the problem as we see it is that these notions of strong and weak are not doing much, because again they can be exchanged by other notions like high and low, when it comes to the quantitative measurements, for instance. And also, one of the issues is that if we are liberal enough with these notions of strong and weak, but also with the notion of defense, then basically anything can be described along those terms. But that would mean that then those notions are basically entirely empty. And I think it's a real worry that that is somehow present, at least in some sense in some writings, that these terms do not then serve more or less any function, at least in some context, not in generally, but in some context. And finally, you asked whether Pareto is sufficiently specific, because it could be applied to any physiological system, and this is something that we completely agree. I agree, and Gregor as well. We've actually discussed this exact point. But here the issue is that we don't mean to provide an account or a framework that would distinguish between the immune system and the let's say other physiological systems. And in part, this is for the reasons I noted in response to your first question and also in the paper. This is because it is actually very difficult to do this distinction in structural or functional terms. So that's one thing to note. But also the purpose of the paper is not to really say what the immune system is, but rather how is it organized. And the fact that other systems can we think also be organized along those terms, should not be taken as an argument against like validity or usefulness of the Pareto framework when we try to apply it in the context of the immune system. So then, what is its use? It's not to demarcate between physiological systems, but rather to make more explicit how the research could be structured, because these organizing principles seem to be most important regarding what we are actually interested in, and that is, for instance, in understanding how the system is organized, but also in manipulating the system. And any sort of manipulations like that clearly have to take into account the knowledge regarding the context dependency and regulation and trade-offs. So yeah, so with that, thanks again for the questions. And
yeah, great. So the floor is now open for questions from anyone in attendance. So you can use the raise hand function, you can add something into the chat, or you can use the Q&A. Any of those is fine. If you've raised your hand, what I will do is make it possible for you to speak and then ask your question. And so we'll go first to, is it Arjun? I apologize if I mistakenly pronounced that, but you should be able to ask your question now.
Thank you. So yes, so my question is, so a lot of this criticism of the received view depends on findings that, so-called immune cells, leukocytes, perform multiple different functions. But like Alan mentioned, there are many ways to individuate a physiological system. And it is perfectly kind of plausible to say that the immune system is just that which defends the host from infection. And we can go and look at which cells participate in immunity, and we may find that all cells participate in immunity. But then it would be absurd to say that all cells are part of the immune system, because then clearly all cells will have all the functions of the entire organism. So if you individuate the immune system based on multiple functions, then you're basically just individuating the whole organism. And that seems a bit strange.
Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, of course, it's not the case that with the claim, for instance, that every cell is an immune cell. It's not to say that every cell is just, the same. Of course not. Not even in terms of like the immunological functions. So there are specialized immune cells which do something that other immune cells don't do. Clearly, I mean, T cells are different from B cells, and macrophages, different kinds of macrophages do things that, for instance, neutrophils can't do, and the other way around. So there is some differentiation clearly in place. That is not what the argument is, but rather that to say that, for instance, the immune system, as composed of the traditional components, that its sole purpose or the predominant function is the defense, is basically problematic still for those reasons that I've noted. I think, namely that that other cell types, non-hematopoietic cells, for instance, do that, even though in a slightly different way. and so on and so forth. But also that the function of defense, as I tried to say, is realized by different components altogether than those of the immune cells themselves. So many of those things are either very general, like for instance, stress responses when it comes to cellular stress or damage responses, but there are some like metabolic adaptations, for instance, that are usually in the domains of other physiological systems, and they actually provide the defense as opposed to, or they decide whether or not the organism is going to survive an infection, for instance. And so in that case, I think that is the most the strongest reason for thinking that defense cannot be ascribed only to the immune system as has been traditionally as it has been traditionally individuated. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so do you want to follow that up really quickly?
Yeah, just quick. So all I'm saying is that there's another way of interpreting the problem. You could simply just say that leukocytes, or those specific cell types which are traditionally associated as belonging to the immune system, have multiple functions other than immunity. Mm-hmm. All cells participate in immunity. Leukocytes participate in immunity. Leukocytes also have other functions. And that does not mean that immunity has other functions. It's just that leukocytes do.
I see. Yeah. Okay. So then basically this would point towards a distinction between, let's say, the notion of immunity and the notion of the immune system, I think, right? Because the immune system would be involved in many other functions, one of which would be immunity, and immunity would be coextensive with defense. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. In that sense, I guess so. But again, then it depends on how we want to, like, then it would be just a terminological dispute in which I don't have any stakes. So I would be okay with that. It's just that oftentimes when you read immunological papers, immunity and immune system are coextensive. So it's not that immunity is a function, rather immunity is immune system, more or less.
Okay, so I think we should move on. We've got a couple questions that came in through the Q&A. And let's see, Leah is asking, is there value to picking out the immune system specifically with a framework? Isn't it useful to see parallels across interconnected systems?
I mean, I'm not sure I understand this question. I think the idea is to, yeah. I mean, okay. So now I do understand. I think that's roughly what we're trying to do. So it's not about just like a framework that would be about the immune system as individualized somehow, but rather something that takes into account the interconnectedness of those physiological system. And if that's the case, then indeed what our framework tries to do is to account for that, and what the arguments against the strong and weak defense are aimed at is exactly to to help see why we need to take into account this interconnectedness of the physiological systems.
Okay, we've got another one that came in through the Q&A function. So let me read that from Ainoa Rodriguez. Apologies if I mistakenly pronounced your name. With recent philosophical research on the immune system focusing on the microbiome, what role do they play in this framework? Are they part of the context, or are they part of the immune system itself?
Yeah, thanks very much. So actually, we can construe them as part of the immune system, because there is this notion co-immunity, for instance, where it's well known now that the microbiome helps in the development of the immune system. It also contributes to immunological functions, including defense, but also other functions that are crucial. And so the microbiome is important in our argument also against the strong-weak defense when we think about the immune system merely as as traditionally defined. And so then, for instance, when we think about what kinds of parts realize immune functions, then we have to take. I mentioned that, for instance, epithelial cells, so other non-immune cells or non-hematopoietic cells engaged in immunological functions, and microbiome also engages in those same functions. So again, the immune system is much broader than just as traditionally conceived in terms of hematopoietic cells, for instance, or cells of hematopoietic origin. So that would be my answer to the role of microbiome.
Okay, any further questions for Martin? Anyone else? Maybe let's just see if I'm not missing something. Okay. All right, well then let me bring our session to a close by first off thanking Martin for his presentation and able defense of his views. And I appreciate him taking the time to share that with us today. And also thank you to everybody who was in attendance. And we appreciate you joining us for these events. And let me just highlight that we will have another International Postdoc Forum in November. What is an informative replication? You can find those details on our website, or you can sign up for alerts by emailing mcps@umn.edu. And with that, I bring our time to a close. Thank you again, Martin, and everybody. Take care and have a nice rest of your day.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.